Good morning, family. Sometimes they don't get both microphones turned on, but I think we got them both on now. Good to see everyone here. My name's Art.
I'm Adam.
We're not a comedy duo. We're a Bible class teaching duo.
He's the bad cop, I'm the good cop.
So we're in the book of Judges. We're in the third week, and we're ready to get into chapter 3 if we can make it that far. The green light's on. I could just talk real loud, but that would be hard on the streaming people, so.
You want to go back there?
I've never been accused. I'm going to let Adam take class over. That's why we got two teachers.
It's a good thing that I've got the first slide this morning. Can you guys hear me?
Now?
Can you hear my mic?
I can talk lower.
Can you hear my mic?
People go, oh, my ears.
I don't think you can hear my mic either. You can? Okay. All right. We can just cancel class. Let's go home. All right.
No.
I heard that.
I was going to say, it's working. I'm whispering.
All right. We promised to get to the first 3 Judges in Judges chapter 3. And we have put what I call circuit breakers in our lesson. If we don't get to specific slides by like 9:30, well, they're just getting dropped, and we're moving on.
That's right.
So like a circuit breaker in a house, man, if we don't get to specific slides, we're going to get to Shamgar one way or another.
Shamgar was the one with the ox goad. He's only got one verse about him, but I want to tell you about his ox goad. So
he calls that an ox goad. I call that a tree trimmer.
I thought about putting the blade on there, but I've got too many grandsons that might hurt themselves. So anyway.
All right, so we're going to start off with a quote. This is from Warren Wiersbe. In his book, Be Available, which is specifically about judges, he says, when God goes to war, he usually chooses the most unlikely soldiers, hands them the most unusual weapons, and accomplishes through them the most unpredictable results. And we'll talk about that today with Othniel, with Ehud, and with Shamgar.
Yeah, we're looking at the book of Judges. I realized that in the first 2 weeks I never really explained what a judge was. But when us today in modern language, when we think of, in our Western culture, a judge is usually an elected or an appointed official. He's somebody that hears court cases and then decides on whether the party is right or wrong, guilty or innocent, and so forth. However, a judge in Bible times had a broader definition than just that. Now, judges did hear cases. They did do that. You'll see Deborah, it talks about Deborah being under the tree of palms, or the tree, the palm tree of Deborah, and hearing cases and so forth. And there's always instances of that. But first and foremost, in the book of Judges, a judge was a military leader, because God would appoint somebody as a judge after the people had sinned and they had an oppressor and the people were being oppressed for a number of years, and then he would want to deliver them from their enemies, and so he would raise up a deliverer. So Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, all in chapter 3 that we're going to look at today, Gideon in chapter 6, Samson in chapter 13. They are all called deliverers, or men who delivered their people from their enemies. Then, of course, the secondary thing is they hear cases that the people have on different matters. And then third, a thing that we don't a lot of times associate with judges, but judges would read God's law to the Israelites and make sure the people stayed familiar with the law and then urge them to obey God's commands. So that was a third aspect of being a judge.
Yeah, so military, political, spiritual. Just to sum that up real quick. And we'll go through, and I've said this before last week, it's interesting, once we get into the reign of kings, it's not until we get to David that we have a single person embodying all of these roles. A military judge, a political judge, and a spiritual judge or leader. All right. So, real quick, a a little bit of recap. What happened before Judges? We had Joshua, Judges 2:7. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done. Throughout the time of Joshua's leadership, the people of God remained faithful in their obedience and devotion to the living God. During this time, God gave the land of promise to Israel and his inheritance, and Joshua successfully led the people. Unfortunately, Dad?
If you continue reading in Judges chapter 2, I'm not going to read all 4 verses there, but it says, another generation, this is after Joshua and his contemporaries, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. That was a bad thing. The people, either the generation ahead of them had not done a good job of telling them what God had done for them, but they just didn't remember. They didn't know. And so, as Judges 3 opens, as we're going to see in a little bit, the Lord sets out his conquest for his people. Not his conquest of enemies, but he's trying to win his people back because they didn't know who he was. And the consequence of that was Israel did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors who brought them out of Egypt. They followed various gods of the people around them, and that aroused the anger of God.
So therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, because this nation has violated the covenant I ordained for their ancestors and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive them out. I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel and see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their ancestors did. So this kind of sets up the 3 judges that we're just about to talk about. Before we do, let's quickly talk about Deuteronomy. We've talked about there being 2 missions in the book of Judges.
God's going to test Israel. Up there, I'm trying to pick a place to start, but then you must destroy them totally. That's God telling the people. God telling the people through Moses what they had to do. Make no treaty with them, show them no mercy, do not intermarry with them, do not give your daughters to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons. I want to read all that because we're going to see all the things they actually did was just the opposite of this. For they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods. And then that last sentence, break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, cut down their Asherah poles, and burn their idols in the fire. God is trying to prevent the Israelites from worshiping another god than him. That's the purpose of all these tests, is to try and get the people to worship God. God left the nations in the land to test all the Israelites because they hadn't experienced war, and this was all intended to keep them from worshiping other gods and to keep them worshiping their God. I'll go off topic here, but
Sorry.
Today, what is something you could do to maybe keep people from worshiping other idols and to keep worshiping God? Tell them about God? I thought of one, and I may get in trouble for. Get rid of television. If we got rid of television, would that keep us from worshiping a lot of the idols that we end up worshiping and help us focus more on God? Now, I'm not against television as an invention, but I think that it has been used in a lot of negative ways. So that might be something that would be synonymous to this smashing all these idols and so forth. And I've got 2 65-inch televisions in my house, so I'm not a proponent of not having a television. So anyway, go ahead, Adam.
But the 2 things God wanted the Israelites to do when they took the land was continue to worship God, don't worship the false idols. The second thing was enact holy war, actually drive out these foreign nations. Don't leave anything alive that breathes, Deuteronomy 20. Completely destroy them. And then we have these names, nations that we've seen before in the past. The Hittites, the Amorites, Canaanites, Pezerites, Hivites, and Jebusites.
Just 6 of them. They left the Girgashites out. But
Poor
anyways,
Girgashites.
yeah, poor Girgashites. Otherwise, they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods. And we've talked about those detestable things in the past, so we won't dwell on that again. You will sin against the Lord your God.
And we talked about in the past that this is not a sprint, this is a marathon. If God asked us all to eat 200 hot dogs, I can do that. It's going to take me 2 months. But I'm going to eat 200 hot dogs.
You only have an hour.
Well, I can't do that, okay? God has asked them to leave nothing alive. He didn't say do it in the first 6 months of conquest. He didn't say, do it under Joshua. He just said leave nothing alive. And one of the points of leaving nations after Joshua, we'll get to that soon, there's a reason for that. It's not because God was lazy. It's not because he didn't think the people could do it. There was a reason. Okay? And then the last thing is, if God asked me to eat 200 hot dogs, I would eat the entire hot dog. I wouldn't eat all the hot dog but leave the crusty bun at the end and throw that away. I wouldn't leave the little twisted hot dog bit at the end and throw it. I would eat the entire hot dog. And this is the problem that the Israelites have. They're supposed to completely destroy these nations, leave nothing alive that breathes. But we see time and time again they don't.
I think it's time to get to chapter 3.
All right, chapter 3. Ta-da! We are now in chapter 3. So, one of the first things in chapter 3, let's start reading. These are the nations the Lord left to test all those Israelites who had not experienced any war in Canaan. Remember, we just read in Deuteronomy, Joshua lived, his contemporaries lived. Once Joshua and the contemporaries died, the next generation didn't know God. The bolded part, the orange part. He did this only to teach warfare to the descendants of Israel who had not had previous battle experience. There was a reason why they went slowly through conquest. It was because if they'd done it quickly, if Joshua destroyed everybody, Joshua's descendants would have no one to go to battle with. Okay? There's a couple reasons why we think they did this. One, to prepare for invaders. Just bringing war or going to war is a talent and a skill they need to have because of invaders. Two, to experience the harshness of disobedience. War is not fun. It's gruesome. And for them to actually recognize that war comes from potentially disobedience. And then there's other reasons. That's you, Dan.
Yep. Are you on my slide?
Yep.
Okay, I'm not going to reread what he read there, but the other reasons is to give each generation a chance for obedience. And teaching warfare to Israel was a matter of providing them opportunities for obedience to the command and purpose of God. God had told them to enter the land and completely destroy the wickedness of the land. In essence, God had commanded them to enter into a holy war against the Canaanites. In order to obey this command, the people had to be ready for war. They needed to be ready for accomplishing the purpose for which God had called them. The test was whether the descendants of the Israelites would obey God where their forefathers had failed. So each time you have one of these judges come along, they had an opportunity to obey God where their forefathers had not obeyed God completely. So would they take the lessons of war God was giving them and use those lessons to finally obey God's command from Deuteronomy? And this, the last verse here, the Lord's commands, let me start the beginning of the sentence. They were left to test the Israelites to see whether they would obey the Lord's commands which he had given their ancestors through Moses. So this will be the last time we will see it referencing as the Lord's commands and coming through Moses. The same concept's going to come up all through Judges, but it's not going to call them commands anymore. It's not going to refer back to Moses anymore. This is going to be the last time here in chapter 3. So the judges are still going to stand under this call of obedience, but they're not going to, those two terms are going to disappear from the book of Judges.
So if this is a test, there's obviously going to be a grade. What grade would you give them? Big old fat F. Judges 3, 5 through 7. The Israelites lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Pezerites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. Right there, we violated the two rules that were set out in Deuteronomy. They didn't destroy the nations, and they intermarried, which ended up leading to worship of these other gods. So what the story of Judges becomes, in one sense, is God's attempt to give each generation the chance to obey. And from the get-go, we see failure. All right.
Yeah. So there's this pattern of disobedience. It starts with Israel doing evil. Then Israel's going to be delivered into the hands of an oppressor, and the oppressor is going to change under different judges. Israel's going to cry out under the oppressor. God's going to hear their cries and give them a deliverer, so they'll receive a deliverer, a judge. Israel will be delivered, and then they'll enjoy a period of peace. Sometimes the period of peace is short. Sometimes it's 40 years. Sometimes it's as long as 80 years. But they'll have a period of peace before this cycle, this pattern will repeat. But, you know, they forgot the Lord their God, and they would serve the Baals and the Asherahs. And so they forgot God's covenant with them. They forgot God's mighty acts of love. They forgot God's acts of deliverance. They forgot God's commands and expectations for holy living. They forgot about God when they chose the direction for their lives. In essence, all around, they did what? They forgot God. Yeah, they disobeyed. Okay. Something we have to guard against. We get busy in our lives, and what do? We ignore or forget God. Yes. Okay. Forgetting God can lead to remembering other gods. Okay. You ready?
All right. So, like this slide before, we've got a pattern of disobedience. Scholars just didn't find this pattern and put things together. We actually have patterns in Scripture. And we're going to demonstrate one of those patterns right now with Judges 2 and Judges 3. You can choose to read along with either one of those. Dad's going to read Judges 2. I'm going to read Judges 3. And I want you to listen specifically to how these verses are similar.
Judges 2 is going to be more of a generic pattern, and then Judges 3 is going to be more of a specific pattern using one of the judges as the example.
Our first judge, Othniel.
Yeah, Othniel. So Judges 2, 11 through 13 reads, Then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them. And they bowed themselves down to them because they provoked the Lord to anger. So they forsook the Lord and served Baal and the Astartes.
All right, Judges 3:7. The sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asheroth.
2:14. And the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he gave them into the hands of plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hands of their enemies around them, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies.
Judges 3:8. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of the Cushan Rishantham king of Mesopotamia. And the sons of Israel served Cushan Rishantham 8 years. Yeah, that's why I got 3. I got the hard names.
2:16. Then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them from the hands of those who plundered them.
When the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the sons of Israel to deliver them. Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother.
Verse 18 of chapter 2. And when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed and afflicted them.
Verse 10. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war. The Lord gave Cushan Rashathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, so that he prevailed over Cushan Rashathaim.
And then verse 19 of chapter 2, but it came about when the judge died that they would turn back and act more corruptly than their fathers in following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not abandon their practices or their stubborn ways.
And wrapping up Judges 3:11 and the first half of 12, then the land had rest 40 years, and Othniel, the king of Kenaz, died. Now the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. So, we call this a pattern. Scholars call this a formula. We'll continue to see this formula, this pattern. It's not just assumed in the actions. We actually see this pattern play out in the Scripture. Okay? We showed it in chapter 2 with a very generic, here's the pattern that typically happens. Chapter 3, we get very specific. We name the oppressor, we name the deliverer, we name the action that got them out of the oppression, we name how long they were at peace for, and then we name the fall back into sin.
Okay.
All right,
We're ahead.
We're good.
Okay, these patterns of disobedience. There's a phrase there that the anger of the Lord burned against Israel so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan Rishathaim. He sold them. That's the term that's used, sold into the hands, or sold them in the English Standard Version, the King James Version, New American Standard Version, New International Version, Revised Standard Version. But there are some versions, International Standard, that said he delivered them into the hands. But in other words, God is turning over the people to an oppressor. He's selling them or delivering them into the hands of these oppressors to try and teach them a lesson. Because they rejected their relationship with him, and because of that, the resulting freedom that comes from that, so then God gave them over to slavery. If they weren't going to accept his leadership and worship him, he was going to take away their freedom and make them slaves, okay, to another people, another king. So
let's read another bit of scripture. I haven't put the book and verse yet, but listen to this. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became foolish and exchanged the glory of their immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds, and animals, and reptiles. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind. That phrase right there, God gave them over to a depraved mind, is very similar to the phrase that we have here. The anger of the Lord burned against them, so against Israel, so he sold them into the hands. My mom's mouthing the verse. She knows what verse it is, right? We're talking about Romans 1. We have a very similar language here in the New Testament that's used in the Old Testament. This idea that in the Old Testament, God purchased the people from the Egyptians, brought them to the land of Canaan. And when they sinned, God sold them back to slavery. He returned the goods back to the store and said, I don't want this anymore. If slavery was the store. We have similar application in Romans, where God has purchased us from sin. And when we ignore that, God just gives us back to sin.
yeah, you could have taken that passage in Romans chapter 1 and just dropped it right in there in Judges chapter 3, and it would have fit right in there. Okay, so we see God's message not changing much in that respect between the Old and the New Testament. Okay, we've covered that one. You want to go on?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So the pattern of disobedience is one side to the coin.
Yeah. The other side
Is God's pattern of faithfulness. Dad, do you want to review that?
So A lot of times in the book of Judges, we focus on the people and their failings and what happens in that cycle. In our class, I would like us to also, more importantly, focus on how God reacts to that and how God behaves, because we want to know today how God is going to behave with us. You know, their sin caused God's anger to burn. So then God would deliver them to an enemy, and then God would hear the cries of distress. That doesn't necessarily mean that Adam and I both went back and looked at that, those cries of distress. Sometimes that can mean they repented, but more often than not, those cries of distress in other places in the Old Testament is just talking about the people suffering and God having mercy on them for their suffering. So in most of these cases, you don't see explicit examples of them asking for forgiveness, but God, out of his compassion, raises a deliverer for them. So we see overt examples of God's compassion throughout the book of Judges for his people. And that's why he then raises up a deliverer, and then God continues. He doesn't just raise up a deliverer, but he's with the deliverer. You know, how can somebody like Shamgar kill 600 Philistines with an 8-foot wooden pole with a point on it, you know, that he would normally use to prod his oxen when they got tired of plowing the field? And he can use that to kill 600 Philistines that were mighty warriors? God had to be on his side, didn't he? Had to be. Now, Othniel, I'm getting ahead of myself.
Go ahead.
Othniel was a mighty warrior. If you go back into the book of Joshua and early in Judges, Othniel was the nephew of Caleb. Caleb's younger brother, Kenaz, was Othniel's father. And Joshua, in one of their battles, had a hard time taking one of the cities. He said, whoever takes this city for me, I'm going to give them my daughter. Guess who takes it? His nephew. So the cousins got married. That was done in the Old Testament. Okay, wasn't unheard of. But she was a sharp gal too, but that's another story. She went to her dad and asked him for some water wells so that land would become more valuable. But anyway, Othniel was a warrior. He was a mighty warrior. Shamgar, who we only have one verse about in chapter 3, he was not a warrior. He was basically a farmer. You know, he didn't have any mighty armor or mighty weapons of war. In fact, their enemies, the Philistines, had probably taken all their weapons away from him. All he had was a sharp stick. That was an 8-foot long sharp stick, but all he had was a sharp stick. Okay? So God does deliver up his people. And the other thing is, God delivers them to an enemy. God does not allow them to sin successfully. He says, okay, I can't, you're supposed to be looking for things when I'm talking. We've got somebody over there wanting to talk.
Who was it?
Is it Butch or
Yeah.
Larry? Just a minute, Butch. Go talk a little bit, Adam.
I'm preparing for my next section. We were talking about this, that the class goes pretty fast because while he's talking, I'm preparing, and while I'm talking, he's preparing. Go ahead, Butch.
I wanted to go back to that phrase, God sold.
Yes, sir.
Not that I've really put a lot of thought into this, but if I go sell something, I expect something in return. I expect a profit, okay? And so I think it shows the compassion of God to use that term, because when God sold them, if that's the correct word, he expected something in return, and that would be faithfulness. That's why he did it. So to me, that still shows the compassion of God.
You want to continue? Hey, Butch, I'll take the mic.
Larry, did you have something to say? Okay, you were trying to get our attention for Butch?
I'll run if I need to.
Okay, so we're looking at these patterns of God's faithfulness. You know, the term used, cried out, occurs 13 times in Judges. When the people cried out, we have 13 judges, and we have the term, the people cried out 13 times. So that's definitely a part of this pattern here. But it generally, it can be a cry for prayer and repentance, a cry of prayer or repentance, but it often generally just refers to a call of distress, kind of like an SOS. The people were sending up to God, and God heard their cry. To me, that just says something about God's character, that he is full of compassion. Okay. Now this next one's me too. Oh,
That was Othniel.
this is Othniel.
You're good.
We've said enough about Othniel. We want to make sure we get to our last two judges.
This is not Ehud. This is
No, Ehud's the judge. This is not Eglon.
This is not Ehud.
Yes.
Remember how the pattern, we mentioned the oppressor, we mentioned the deliverer, we mentioned the action, and then we mentioned the years of peace and the return to sin. This is Eglon, the king of Moab.
This is not really Eglon, but
No.
all of the pictures we could find of Eglon, all of the drawings were copyright protected, but this one was in Wikimedia Commons, and he really looks a lot like the pictures they make of Eglon, because the scripture says Eglon was a very fat man.
He was.
And Jabba the Hutt is a very fat man. In fact, did you want to talk about?
Yeah, we'll talk about that. So, real quick, when we talk about Ehud and Eglon, we need to start with some geographic background. Starting in verse 15, if you've got your Bible open, chapter 3. When the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer. Back up to verse 12. Now the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. The Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord. He gathered to himself the sons of Ammon and Amalek, and he went and defeated Israel, and they possessed the city of the palm trees. The sons of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. Now, Moab is down here. Ammon and Amalek, they're right here. What they end up doing is crossing the Jordan here, and the city of Palm is near Jericho. Not Jericho, but near Jericho. Why is that, Dad?
Well, Jericho was destroyed, but Jericho did have the name City of Palms. That was a term used for Jericho. When Joshua destroyed Jericho, remember, the walls all fell down. It was all destroyed. The last verse of Joshua about the destruction of Jericho was a curse. If any man lays on the foundation of Jericho, any stones, or if any man rebuilds the gates of Jericho, a curse will be on him, and his firstborn will die. So the Israelites were a little hesitant about rebuilding Jericho. Richard.
All around that area, north of the Dead Sea, is palm plantations everywhere.
Yes.
In that area.
Yeah, he said all around that area north of the Dead Sea was palms and palm plantations. Yes, there were lots of natural springs around Jericho, and of course, anytime you have a spring in that area of the world, they would have date palms that would be there. So it was known as the City of Palms. So when it referred to the City of Palms, it was really referring. So that's where the Moabites came and kind of made their not capital, but their
Seat of power.
Seat of power against the Israelites, yeah. And so then the Israelites would then have to bring them tribute.
And so we go on from there. Verse 15, but the sons of Israel cried to the Lord raised up a deliverer for them, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjaminite, a left-handed man. And the sons of Israel sent tribute by him to Eglon, the king of Moab. All right, a lot to unpack in that verse. First off, Dad and I had long discussions about this. I think there's some wordplay going on because Benjamin means man of my right hand. And we're talking about Eglon, who's called out as being left-handed. Not Eglon, Ehud. And so I think there's some wordplay going on here. The other thing that's interesting, if we go to chapter 20, we talk about more left-handed Benjaminites. And there's some discussion among scholars that the translation here, left-handed, actually means not right-handed. Does that make sense? If you're not right-handed, you're one of two things. Either you're left-handed, or you're a switch hitter in baseball, you're a really good point guard in basketball, you're a really good forward in soccer, you're ambidextrous. You can use both sides. And so there's discussion here that while, yes, he might be left-handed, he also might be ambidextrous. And that the tribes of Benjamin have a preference to train their warriors to be ambidextrous, to use both hands. That's why we continue to call them out. All right. Doesn't change the story hardly at all, but I thought it was interesting. Yeah, I didn't want to talk about it because it didn't change the story hardly at all. All right.
I do the same thing, so I'm not going to, I'll take a pass.
So verse 16, Ehud made himself a sword. Let's continue with 15. And the sons of Israel sent tribute by him to Eglon, king of Moab. The Hebrew word tribute here later on in Corinthians, or in Chronicles, and Samuel, and Kings, starts taking on the context of food offering. So we're not talking about tributes of gold. Imagine in your mind this is a food offering.
If you're a very fat man, you're going to want a bunch more food. You're not going to want gold. You're going to want the dates and the quail tongues and the, whatever delicacies they might be able to offer this guy. Go ahead.
All right. So verse 16, Ehud made himself a sword, which he had 2 edges, a cubit in length. Dad, how long is a cubit?
What's a cubit? Anybody know a cubit? Oh, that's what we commonly think, 18 inches. 44 to 45 centimeters if you're into that measurement scale. It's not really 18 inches. The literal translation of a cubit in Hebrews is it's your forearm. It's from your elbow to your tallest finger. Adam, measure my forearm to my tallest finger.
It is 19 inches.
I'm above average. But 18 inches is a good approximation, okay? So an 18-inch, he made what that was a cubit long? A sword?
Sword.
I don't have any swords, and I don't have any knives that are 18 inches. This one's 14 inches, and I'm guessing that this sword he made was probably about that thin, but this is 15 inches. It was really 3 inches longer than this. He took a sword with him. He was a craftsman, made this sword himself, put it on his right thigh, and bound it there under his robe. He's in essence doing what? Hiding it. He's a left-handed man. He can reach across, draw that thing out, and we're going to see what he does with it in a minute.
All right, verse 17, he presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now, Eglon was a very fat man. Okay, this is starting to make more sense. We're bringing food tribute to a very fat man. The interesting word here, fat, we see that word used in Genesis to talk about the fatted calf. It's typically used to talk about, let me read this. Most often, it signifies good quality animals ready for sacrifice. Eglon is thus pictured as very pleasingly plump, a perfect creature for sacrifice. All right. Moving on, verse 18. It came about when he had finished presenting the tribute that he sent away the people who had carried the tribute. So imagine in your mind, Eglon comes as the representative. Ehud comes as the representative. Ehud has servants with platters of food, bringing it to Eglon. Eglon's consuming the food and eating the food. And then all of a sudden...
Ehud sends all of them away to safety. So
Yeah,
they all leave.
Ehud-
It's just Ehud there is the only Israelite.
So the Eglon is satisfied. He sends the servants away. Verse 19, but he himself turned back from the idols which were at Gilgal and said, I have a secret for you, O king, he said. And the king said, keep silence. And all who attended him left. The word secret here in Hebrew could have connotation of a prophetic oracle or word from God. And so Ehud continues on saying, Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in the cool roof chamber, and he had said, I have a message from you from God. The word God here, we're not talking about Yahweh. It's Elohim.
It could be Could be God, but the Moabite could misinterpret it as being his God.
Right. If a Hebrew were to say Elohim, they're going to say, oh, that's Yahweh. That is the one true God. Eglon, man, I'm having a hard time with that. Eglon, when he hears Elohim, might think, oh, that's the Canaanite. That's the Canaanite God. And so he's more receptive to bring Ehud closer. Verse 21, Ehud stretched out his left hand, took his sword from his right thigh, thrust it into his belly. The handle also went in after the blade. The fat closed over the blade. For he did not draw the sword out of his belly. And
if he was a surgeon, he would have just committed malpractice. He left his instrument inside his patient.
And in the NASB, the verse closes with, and the refuse came out.
There's again, it was copyrighted, but there's a Sunday school song for little kids, and the guy plays the guitar while he does it, so I didn't want to use it. But he talks about, he doesn't call it refuse. He relating to first and second graders. He calls it poop. He said the poop came out. And that makes sense because then later on, as you're reading there, the servants wouldn't come in because they thought he was relieving himself.
Right.
They smelled something, and they thought, we don't want to go in there. He's taking care of his business. You know, he's got his feet covered, which is another...
we don't have time for that.
We're out of time.
All right, so it came about that, verse 27, it came about when he had arrived. So he leaves, he goes to Ephraim, he blew the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the sons of Israel went down with him from the hill country. He said to them, pursue them, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hands. So we went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan, opposite Moab. So the first thing Ehud does, he takes out the king. The second thing he does, he amasses an army and puts them right here on the Jordan. So either the Moabites that are at the city of Palms, either they can go all around the Dead Sea to get back to Moabite, or they could go to their allies across the Jordan, and the first thing Ehud does is cut off that retreat. Because of that, the Lord gives them, because of Ehud being the judge, the deliverer, they give them victory, and they end up killing 10,000 Moabites.
All of the Moabites that were on the west side of the Jordan.
All right.
That's our story of Ehud.
It's your turn. Sorry.
Shamgar. That's all we have about Shamgar. After him was Shamgar, the last verse of chapter 3, the son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad. This is my semblance of an ox goad. And he also saved Israel. I'm going to make a lesson out of this one verse. Okay. What's the lessons we can learn about Shamgar? He had success. So what lessons can we learn from that? Start from where you are. He was out in the field. He saw these 600 Philistines coming. He grabbed whatever was ready, an ox goad. You know, a lot of times we can say, I can't do anything, I'm raising my kids. I can't do anything, I'm in college. I can't do anything. You have to start where you are when it comes to serving God. If you wait till you're ready, the Philistines will kill you. You have to start from where you are if you're going to serve God. You can't waste your life waiting for things to be different before you do something. That's the first lesson from Shamgar. Use what you've got. You know, a lot of times we think, you know, I don't have enough talents to teach. I don't have enough talents to do this. I don't have enough talents to do that. But you've got the things that God gave you. Use what God gave you. Stop focusing on what you don't have and concentrate on what you do have. Don't see that glass as half empty. See that glass as half full. The third lesson, do what you can. You know, of course, the most powerful weapon we have is prayer. You can always pray. Second, you can stay focused. If Shamgar hadn't have stayed focused, he wouldn't have been able to kill 600 guys with a pointy stick. Not 600 warriors. He was a farmer. He wasn't even a warrior. You know, just like Paul said, this one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and reaching forward to what lies ahead. That's Philippians 3:13. Paul doesn't say, this one thing I do, or he doesn't say, I could have done 50 other things. He focuses on the one thing. And My point is, we all have a God-given purpose as Christians. Shamgar had a purpose, and he succeeded in it because he had faith in his God. If you have faith in your God, you can succeed too. Our class is over. Be a